Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the silent, velvet-draped room, but it was the shadow rising from the wheelchair that stopped Julian's heart cold. Julian Vane pressed his back against the mahogany door, his breath hitching in his throat as the man across the room, the man who had supposedly been paralyzed from the waist down for 5 years, slowly, deliberately, stood up. There was no shaking, no struggle for balance. Cassian Thorne rose with the predatory grace of a panther uncoiling from a long slumber, his towering height instantly sucking the air out of the luxury suite. Julian's hands trembled as he reached behind him, fumbling for the handle he had just locked, but it was too late. Cassian took a step, then another. The heavy thud of his boots on the Persian rug was the sound of a trap snapping shut. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Julian," Cassian murmured, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. He unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling up the sleeves of his pristine white shirt to reveal forearms corded with muscle that shouldn't exist on an invalid. Or perhaps, you're just remembering the invitation you gave me 3 years ago. To understand the terror clawing at Julian's throat, one had to understand the arrogance that had put him there. 3 years ago, Julian Vane was the golden prince of the city's socialite scene. He was beautiful, wealthy, and cruel in the careless way that only the untouchable can be. He was the youngest son of the Vane banking empire, a young man who treated the world as his personal playground. And Cassian Thorne was his favorite target. The Thornes were old money, stoic and powerful, but Cassian was the broken heir. Following a car accident that claimed his parents' lives, Cassian had retreated into a wheelchair, managing the family conglomerate from the shadows. He was quiet, intense, and rarely seen in public. Except for that one night. The winter solstice gala. Julian had been drunk, too much vintage champagne, and too much adulation from sycophants. He had spotted Cassian in the corner of the ballroom, sitting in that sleek, black wheelchair, looking bored and detached. To Julian's inebriated mind, Cassian's silence felt like judgment. It felt like a challenge. Julian had sauntered over, swaying slightly, his cheeks flushed with alcohol and hubris. He had leaned down, bracing his hands on the armrests of Cassian's chair, trapping the air. The music had been loud, but the silence between them was louder. "You always look so serious, Cassian," Julian had slurred, his eyes half-lidded. He grabbed Cassian's tie, yanking the man forward until their noses almost touched. "Don't you ever want to have fun?" Cassian had stared at him, his eyes the color of storm clouds, gray, turbulent, and utterly unamused. "Go back to your friends, Julian. You're drunk." The dismissal stung. Julian, used to being desired, felt a spike of petty rage. He leaned in and crushed his lips against Cassian's. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was a kiss of domination, a branding. He forced his tongue past Cassian's lips, tasting the cold shock of the other man. When he finally pulled back, Cassian was wiping his mouth with a handkerchief, his expression unreadable. That was when Julian had whispered it. The words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had looked down at Cassian's legs, sneered, and said, "If you didn't like it, you'd do something about it. But you can't, can you? Why don't you come up here and teach me a lesson?" He had walked away laughing, leaving the crippled heir amidst the whispering crowd. He didn't know it then, but he had just signed his own death warrant. The fall of the House of Vane was not swift. It was a slow, agonizing rot. 6 months after the gala, the audits began. Then came the frozen assets, the scandals, the arrests. Julian's father was indicted for embezzlement on a scale that shattered the economy. The Golden Prince became a pariah. The friends who drank his champagne vanished. The luxury penthouses were seized. By the second year, Julian was living in a squalid apartment, working 3 jobs just to keep his mother in a state-run care facility. He was thin, exhausted, and humbled. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate need to survive. Then came the debt collectors. Not the banks, but the shadow lenders his father had borrowed from in a last-ditch effort to save the company. They wanted their money, or they wanted blood. Julian was cornered in an alleyway behind the restaurant where he washed dishes, 3 men with steel pipes closing in. He closed his eyes, waiting for the first blow. It never came. Instead, a black limousine pulled up to the curb, displacing the rainwater in a murky wave. The back window rolled down. "Get in." The voice was familiar. Julian opened his eyes to see Cashin Thorne watching him from the shadows of the car's interior. Julian had no choice. He climbed in, dripping wet, shivering, smelling of dishwater and fear. Cashin didn't look at him. He stared straight ahead, his profile sharp and cold. "Your father's debt has been purchased. You owe 20 million credits." I can't pay that," Julian whispered, his teeth chattering. "I know," Cashin said. He finally turned, his gray eyes sweeping over Julian's ragged appearance. "So you will work it off. You will be my personal assistant. You will live in my house. You will do exactly as I say, when I say it, until the debt is cleared." "Why?" Julian asked, his voice breaking. "Why help me?" Cashin's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "Help you?" "No, Julian. I'm acquiring an asset. And I haven't forgotten our last conversation." Life at Thorne Manor was a gilded cage. The estate was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of dark stone and endless corridors, nestled on a cliff overlooking a churning sea. It was beautiful, cold, and lonely. Julian's role was undefined and all-encompassing. He was a secretary, a valet, a servant. He managed Cashin's schedule, he poured his wine, he pushed his wheelchair through the extensive gardens. Cashin was a demanding master. He was precise, exacting, and cold. He never raised his voice, but his silence was a weapon. He would watch Julian with an intensity that made Julian's skin prickle, as if he were dissecting him. Yet, it wasn't the torture Julian expected. There were no beatings, no starvation. The cruelty was psychological. "Pour the tea, Julian." "No, it's too cold." "Pour it again." "Read the report aloud." "You stumbled on page 3. Start over." "My legs are cramping." "Massage them." That was the worst task. Every night, Julian had to kneel before the wheelchair in Cashin's bedroom, his hands working over the muscles of Cashin's legs. The muscles were atrophied, but not as much as Julian expected for someone paralyzed for 5 years. The skin was warm. Kneeling there, with his head bowed, Julian felt the weight of his past arrogance crushing him. This was his penance. He was the servant now, the one looking up. But there were moments, fleeting, confusing moments, where the dynamic shifted. One evening, a heavy book fell from the top shelf of the library, striking Julian on the shoulder. He cried out, clutching his arm. "Julian." Cashin's voice was sharp, immediate. He wheeled himself over with startling speed. "Let me see." "It's fine," Julian gasped, trying to pull away. "I said let me see." Cashin's hand shot out, gripping Julian's wrist. His grip was iron-strong. He pulled Julian down to his level, his eyes scanning Julian's face with a frantic energy that didn't match his usual icy demeanor. His fingers were gentle as he probed the bruised shoulder. For a second, their faces were inches apart. Julian could smell the sandalwood and expensive tobacco on Cashin. He saw the flecks of silver in Cashin's gray eyes. His heart hammered, not from fear, but from something else, a sudden, electric tension that left him breathless. Cashin stared at his lips. The memory of that forced kiss hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, the mask slammed back down. Cashin released him, his face closing off. "Go to the infirmary. You're useless to me, injured." The breaking point came 3 months into his servitude. The Thorne family was a nest of vipers. Cashin's aunt, Lady Alara, was visiting. She was a woman with a smile like a shark and eyes that calculated the value of everything she saw. She made no secret of her disdain for Cashin, whom she viewed as a cripple holding on to power he couldn't defend. Dinner was a torture session. Julian stood by the wall, silent and invisible, as Alara picked apart Cashin's business decisions, his health, his isolation. "Really, Cashin," Alara said, swirling her wine. "It's time you stepped down. The board is concerned. A CEO who can't even walk up the stairs to the boardroom? It projects weakness." Cashin cut his steak with surgical precision. "My mind walks circles around the board, Aunt Alara. That is sufficient. Is it?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "And keeping this pet," she gestured vaguely at Julian with her fork, "is hardly appropriate. The son of a criminal? It looks desperate." Julian flinched. "Julian is efficient," Cashin said, his voice dropping an octave. "And he is none of your concern." "He's a distraction," Alara hissed. You need a wife. Someone to produce an heir, since you're clearly incapable of doing anything else. The insult was gross, ableist, and cruel. Julian saw Cashin's hand tighten on his steak knife until his knuckles turned white. Later that night, a storm battered the coast. Thunder rattled the window panes of the manor. Julian was in the library, organizing files, when the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. Julian. Cashin's voice came from the doorway. I'm here, sir. I'll find a flashlight. No need. Lightning flashed, illuminating Cashin in his chair. He looked agitated, his hair disheveled. He wheeled himself into the room. My aunt. She has arranged something. An accident. Julian froze. What? I have intercepted communications. There are men coming tonight. Mercenaries. They plan to stage a break-in gone wrong. We have to call the police. Julian scrambled for his phone. The lines are cut. The cell jammers are active. Cashin's voice was terrifyingly calm. They are already inside the grounds. Then we have to hide you, Julian said, panic rising. He rushed to the wheelchair. There's a panic room in the cellar, right? I can get you there. Julian. We have to hurry. If they find you, Julian, stop. The door to the library burst open. 3 men stood there, dressed in tactical gear, rain dripping from their balaclavas. They held silenced pistols. Well, the leader sneered. The cripple and his pet. Easy payday. Julian didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just moved. He threw himself in front of Cashin, spreading his arms wide. He was shaking, terrified, but he wouldn't let them touch him. He wouldn't let them hurt the man who had, in his own twisted way, saved him from the streets. Don't touch him, Julian screamed. The gunman laughed. Cute. He raised his weapon, aiming at Julian's chest. Bang! The gunshot was deafening. But Julian didn't feel the bullet. He heard a sound behind him, a mechanical whir, the rush of air. A hand grabbed the back of his collar and yanked him backward with impossible force. Julian went flying, crashing into the heavy oak desk. He looked up dazed. Cashin was not in the chair. Cashin was in the air. He had launched himself from the wheelchair, twisting his body with the agility of a gymnast. He landed on the gunman, his hand chopping down on the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The gun clattered to the floor. Cashin moved like a blur. He wasn't just walking, he was a weapon. He delivered a roundhouse kick to the second man's temple, sending him crashing into a bookshelf. The third man hesitated, shock visible even through his mask. That hesitation was his end. Cashin closed the distance, grabbing the man by the throat and slamming him against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Silence fell over the library, broken only by the heavy rain and the groans of the unconscious men. Julian sat on the floor, mouth agape, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. Cashin stood there, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He straightened his jacket, rolled his neck, and then turned slowly to look at Julian. I told you, Cashin said, his voice dark. I intercepted the communications. I knew they were coming. I needed them to commit the act so I could handle it. You, Julian stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Cashin's legs. You can walk, Cashin finished. He took a step toward Julian. Yes, for 2 years now. The nerves healed. The therapy was excruciating, but successful. But what? Julian whispered. Why hide it? Because my enemies are everywhere, Cashin said, stepping closer. Because as long as they thought I was broken, they were careless. They revealed their plots. Aunt Alara revealed her hand tonight, because she thought I was helpless prey. He loomed over Julian now. And you played your part perfectly, Julian. The fallen prince, serving the invalid. It sold the illusion. Julian felt a surge of betrayal mixed with relief. You used me. I did. You let me carry you. Let me massage your legs. Let me think you were weak. Tears pricked Julian's eyes. Was it all a game? Was I just a prop? Cashin reached down, grabbing Julian's arm and hauling him to his feet. He didn't let go. He pulled Julian flush against his chest. The heat coming off him was immense. No, Cashin growled, his face inches from Julian's. You were never just a prop. You were the only variable I couldn't calculate. What are you talking about? Tonight, Cashin murmured, his gaze dropping to Julian's lips. You stood in front of a gun for me. For the man you're supposed to hate. What? I don't know. Julian breathed. Liar. Cashin walked him backward. Julian stumbled, retreating until his back hit the cold stone of the fireplace mantel. Cashin caged him in, placing his hands on the mantel on either side of Julian's head. This was the scene from the gala, reversed. But the power dynamic was shattered. Julian wasn't the drunken predator anymore. He was the trembling prey, and the dragon had woken up. 3 years ago, Cashin whispered, his voice rough with suppressed adrenaline. You told me to come up and teach you a lesson. Julian shivered. Cashin, I remember every word, Julian. You taunted me. You forced yourself on me because you thought I couldn't reach you. Cashin leaned in, his lips brushing Julian's ear. Well, I'm up here now. I'm standing right in front of you. Cashin's knee pressed between Julian's thighs, hard and demanding. So tell me, Cashin challenged, pulling back to look into Julian's wide, fearful eyes. Are you ready to learn? You're crazy, Julian gasped, though his hands involuntarily clutched the lapels of Cashin's jacket. I am a man who has spent 5 years in a chair, waiting for the moment to strike, Cashin said. I have patience you can't imagine. And I have wanted to wipe that arrogant smirk off your face since the moment we met. I don't have a smirk anymore, Julian whispered. You took everything from me. Not everything, Cashin corrected. I took your money. I took your pride. But I haven't taken you. He kissed him. It wasn't like the kiss at the gala. This was an annihilation. Cashin kissed him with the pent-up hunger of a starving man. He devoured Julian, his tongue sweeping into Julian's mouth, demanding submission. It was angry, possessive, and terrifyingly hot. Julian melted. All the fear, the stress, the confusion of the last 3 years collapsed under the onslaught of Cashin's dominance. He wrapped his arms around Cashin's neck, clinging to him as the only solid thing in a world that had turned upside down. Cashin groaned, a low, guttural sound, and lifted Julian up, pressing him harder against the wall. Julian's legs wrapped around Cashin's waist instinctively, the waist of a man who could hold him effortlessly. You knew. Julian gasped when they finally broke for air. You knew I wanted you back then. Even when I was being cruel. I knew you were a brat who needed to be humbled. Cashin growled, biting lightly at Julian's jawline. And I knew that one day, I would be the one to do it. What happens now? Julian asked, his voice trembling. Do I go back to pushing the chair? Cashin pulled back, smoothing Julian's hair away from his forehead. The aggression faded, replaced by a fierce, protective intensity. No, Cashin said. The chair is gone. The ruse is over. Alara will be dealt with by morning. And the debt is paid, Cashin said softly. You saved my life tonight. Consider the account settled. Julian felt a pang of panic. So, I leave. Cashin's eyes darkened. He tightened his grip on Julian's hips. Do you want to leave? Julian looked at the man who had been his tormentor, his master, and now, his savior. He looked at the strength in Cashin's standing form, the fire in his eyes. He realized that the cage he had been living in wasn't the manor. It was his own life before this. No, Julian whispered. Good, Cashin said, claiming his lips again. Because I have a lot of lessons left to teach you. And I expect you to be a very diligent student. The morning sun broke over the cliffs of Neoviridia, illuminating the shattered glass of the library window. Police cars swarmed the driveway. Lady Alara was being escorted out in handcuffs, screaming about conspiracies. On the balcony above, 2 figures watched. Cashin stood tall, leaning against the railing, a cane in his hand, a prop for the public transition, nothing more. Julian stood beside him, no longer in the servant's uniform, but in a tailored suit that fit him like a second skin. Cashin reached out, his fingers interlacing with Julian's. He didn't look at Julian. He looked out at the horizon, at the empire he had reclaimed. They will talk, Cashin said. They will say you slept your way back to the top. Let them talk, Julian replied, squeezing Cashin's hand. A ghost of his old, sharp smile returned, but this time, it lacked the cruelty. It was the smile of a survivor. I'd like to see them try to stop us. Cashin turned to him, lifting Julian's hand to his lips. Let them come. We'll be waiting. And that is how the viper tamed the wolf. If you enjoyed seeing Julian finally submit to the true master of the house, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a man who pretended to be paralyzed just to trap you? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then.